Imagine being in the heart of a devastating war, where every day is a battle for survival. In the midst of the chaos, two strangers meet. Amara, a nurse determined to save lives, and Kieran, a soldier carrying the guilt of a dark past. But what if this meeting was more than a coincidence? When their refugee camp is attacked, they face deadly dilemmas, devastating truths, and choices that could cost them everything. Can love bloom amid the ashes of war? Or will the shadows of Kieran's past destroy any chance of redemption? Stay until the end of this story, because the sacrifice they will make will surprise you in ways you never imagined. Don't blink. Every second counts. The grey sky of the Republic of Eldoria seemed a mirror of the chaos in the refugee camp. Amara got out of the truck with her backpack full of medical supplies, her gaze fixed on the makeshift hospital ahead. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and she had to cover her nose with a handkerchief. "Is this your first time in a refugee camp?" asked a man in a blood-stained coat. He had a tough but tired expression. "Yes," Amara replied, still observing the haggard and injured faces around her. "I didn't know it would be so devastating." The doctor nodded, his shoulders heavy with the weight of experiences that seemed to age him. "You don't get used to it. Just learn to keep breathing," he said, before walking away, called by a patient. Amara headed to the makeshift hospital where the smell of disinfectant and sweat filled the air. He started to organize the medicines when he heard screams outside. He ran to the entrance where a group of soldiers carried a stretcher with a bloodied man. "He was hit in the fight!" shouted one of the soldiers, his face tense. Amara quickly approached, examining the patient. He had deep cuts and a gunshot wound to his leg. His eyes were closed, but his face seemed to be fighting the pain. "What's his name?" she asked, adjusting the sheet on the stretcher. "Kieran. He's from the forward detachment," replied one of the soldiers. Amara began cleaning the wounds, preparing to treat the leg wound. "Will he survive?" asked another soldier nervously. "If you give me space to work, he'll have a chance," Amara replied firmly, pushing them away. While stitching the wounds, Kieran opened his eyes, blinking slowly. He looked confused. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. "You are safe," Amara said without stopping working. "I'm taking care of you." He gave a weak if bitter laugh. "No one is safe here. Neither do you." Amara stared at him for a moment, trying to understand that dark intensity in his voice. Then he went back to work. "Maybe not, but at least you're alive. That's what matters now." Kieran didn't respond, but closed his eyes again. The next day, Amara saw him trying to get up. He leaned on the edge of the bed, his face pinched in pain. "You should be resting," she said, approaching with a serious expression. "I don't have time for that," he replied, trying to hide the weakness in his voice. "I have to go back." "Back to where?" Amara crossed her arms, suspicious. "You can barely stand." "To the battlefield," Kieran said, as if it were obvious. "I can't stay here while others are fighting." Amara shook her head, frustrated. "You're going to kill yourself like this. You need to heal before anything else." Kieran stopped trying to get up and looked straight into her eyes. "I'm already dead if I can't protect these people." Before she could respond, he walked away. Later, Amara saw Kieran leave with the same determination. Even though he was injured, he seemed to carry the weight of the entire war. As she watched him go, she felt an uneasiness grow within her. Something about him seemed to scream louder than the sound of bombs in the distance. Weeks had passed since Amara last saw Kieran leave, still hurt but determined. She was caring for children at the hospital when she heard agitated voices outside. When he came out, he saw soldiers carrying a stretcher in a hurry. "We have a critically injured person," shouted one of them. Amara ran to the gurney and froze for a moment when she saw Kieran, unconscious, with a pale face and deep cuts on his shoulder and back. Again. he murmured, before taking control. "Take him inside. Now." Inside the hospital, Amara cleaned Kieran's wounds while he groaned in pain, still unconscious. After long minutes of work, he managed to stabilize it. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Amara's worried face. "You again?" He tried to smile, but the pain stopped him. "And you, he can't seem to stay out of trouble," Amara replied, crossing her arms. "Or from me." Kieran let out a weak laugh, but soon looked away, his expression turning dark. "Maybe I deserve this," he murmured. Amara leaned in, surprised by the statement. "Why would you say something like that?" Kieran sighed, looking up at the ceiling. "Because I've done things I can't forget. Things that took the lives of people who didn't deserve to die." Amara remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I was once ordered to bomb a village. They said it was an enemy base, but it was full of civilians, families, children." He closed his eyes, the pain visible on his face. "I followed orders. Then I discovered the truth." "And that's why you keep fighting?" Amara asked, her voice soft. "To make up for what he did?" Kieran nodded slowly. "I try to save as many lives as I can, but that doesn't erase what I did." Amara watched him for a long moment before responding. "You can't change the past, but maybe what you're doing now matters more than you think." He looked at her, as if those words carried an unexpected weight. "Do you believe that?" he asked. "I believe," Amara replied firmly. "Because if we don't believe we can be better, then what are we left with?" Kieran didn't respond, but the expression on his face seemed lighter. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of something that didn't feel like guilt, hope. The morning brought a thick fog that enveloped the refugee camp like a veil. Amara was organizing supplies when a doctor approached, holding an envelope. "This came to you," he said, handing over the paper with a cautious expression. Amara quickly opened the envelope and found a letter from an international aid organization. They were asking that she be transferred to a hospital in a safer area. It was an opportunity to work in better conditions, but it would leave the field and, more importantly, Kieran behind. As she pondered, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "What is happening?" "You look worried," Kieran asked, still leaning on the improvised cane he had been using since his last injury. She hesitated before responding. "I was offered a transfer to a hospital in a safer area." Kieran stared at her for a moment without expressing much. "Sounds like a good idea. You should go," he said, trying to sound indifferent. Amara crossed her arms, studying him. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "It's not about what I want," Kieran replied, looking away. "It's about what's best for you." "And you think I'd be better off away from here?" Amara took a step forward, her voice firmer. Far from you?" Kieran took a deep breath, his shoulders dropping in a gesture of resignation. "You don't understand. This place, this war, everything here consumes people. I don't want this to destroy you like it destroyed me. Maybe you gave up on yourself, but I didn't give up on you," Amara replied, her voice full of emotion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air seemed palpable. Finally, Kieran sighed, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I can't promise anything, Amara. I can't offer you anything." He looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "But if you stay, it means more than you know." She gave a slight smile, placing a hand on his arm. "I don't want promises, Kieran. I want to be here. For you, for these people. I want to fight alongside you." He didn't say anything, but a subtle gleam of relief appeared in his eyes. For the first time, he felt he wasn't alone. The sound of explosions in the distance announced the worst. The war was advancing towards the refugee camp. Amara rushed to the makeshift hospital, where civilians and doctors were panicking. Kieran walked in close behind, holding his arm as blood oozed from a fresh cut. "We have to evacuate now," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Amara tried to calm a mother who was holding her crying child. "There are buses ready to take people to a safe place," she said, trying to sound confident. "Let's get everyone out of here." Kieran pulled her aside, his gaze serious. "I need you to help with the injured, but if the situation gets worse, I want you to go with them," he stated, pointing to the waiting buses. "Don't ask me to do that," Amara replied, shaking her head. "I won't leave you." Before he could argue, an explosion rocked the hospital. Kieran rushed to help carry the injured, while Amara tried to calm the patients. "Keep calm! Let's get out of here!" she shouted. In the middle of the evacuation, an older man approached Amara, looking at Kieran angrily. "He shouldn't be here!" shouted the man. "This soldier, he was part of the operation that killed my family." Amara froze, looking at Kieran, who remained silent, his eyes downcast. "Is he lying?" Amara asked, her voice shaking. Kieran sighed, his face heavy with guilt. "No, I was there, but I didn't know what we were actually doing. I just followed orders, and when I realized it, it was too late. The silence between them seemed to scream." Amara took a step back, trying to process the words. "You were there," he murmured, "but now you're here, fighting to save these same people." "That doesn't erase what I did," Kieran replied, his voice hoarse. "But I try to make it mean something." Amara took a deep breath, holding back crying. She knew he carried immense pain, but she also saw that he was not the same man who had made those mistakes. "I choose to believe in who you are now," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "and not what you were." Kieran blinked in surprise. Before he could respond, another explosion shook the ground. He grabbed Amara, pulling her to safety. "This is not the time to talk about that," he said, grabbing a gun and going back to work. "We need to get out of here." They continued to evacuate people, facing crossfire and widespread chaos. At the end of the day, as the last buses left, Kieran leaned against a wall, exhausted. Amara walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You saved many lives today," she said. He gave a slight smile. "Not alone." Amara smiled back, aware that despite the darkness, they were finding light together. Dawn brought a deceptive calm to the refugee camp. The last bus was being loaded, while Amara checked on the remaining patients. Kieran was nearby, organizing the few soldiers who could still fight. The look between them was one of complicity, but also of concern. "You should go on the next bus," Kieran said, walking towards her with slow steps, still feeling the effects of the injury. "This is far from over, and I cannot guarantee your safety." Amara shook her head, frustrated. "We've already talked about this. I'm not leaving without you." Before he could respond, the sound of gunshots cut through the air. A group of enemy soldiers appeared at the entrance to the camp, and panic took over again. Civilians rushed to the buses as Kieran grabbed a gun, facing the situation with determination. "Get them out of here!" he shouted to Amara. "I'll hold them!" "No!" Amara shouted back, holding his arm. "You can't do this alone!" Kieran looked at her intensely. "It's the only chance. You need to trust me." She hesitated, but saw the firmness in his gaze. Without saying anything else, he ran to the bus, helping the last civilians to get on. As the vehicle began to move, she looked back and saw Kieran positioning himself to guard the exit. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and explosions. Kieran led a small group of soldiers, holding off the enemy as much as he could. Amara, on the bus, watched with her heart in her throat. When the vehicle finally reached a safe location, she quickly got out, determined to get back. "Amara, no!" shouted one of the doctors. "You can't do that." "I have to," she replied, running back towards the field. When he arrived, he saw Kieran lying on the ground, injured but still conscious. He looked at her with a mixture of surprise and relief. "I said go away," he murmured, trying to smile. Did you really think I would leave you? Amara knelt beside him, pressing on the wound in his abdomen to stop the bleeding. Kieran held her hand, his eyes shining with something beyond pain. You were the best thing that happened in my life. Even in this hell, he said, his voice weakening. Don't say this as if it were the end. Amara replied, tears streaming down her face. I won't let you go. With the help of other soldiers, she managed to take Kieran to the last available vehicle. As he was being treated on the way, his breathing became irregular. Amara held his hand tightly, whispering, Stay with me, please, Kieran. When they arrived at the nearest hospital, doctors took over care, and Amara was forced to wait. Hours passed until one of the doctors came out with a faint smile. He will survive, he announced. Amara felt her legs weaken with relief. Entering the room, he saw Kieran lying down, still pale, but with a small smile. I said I wouldn't leave you, she murmured, holding his hand. You really are stubborn, he joked, his voice still weak. And you're going to have to live with that, she replied, smiling through her tears. Together they realized that, despite the scars of war, they had found something worth fighting for, the light in the midst of darkness.